900-pound Harley-Davidsons don't stop for anything, let alone on a scorching interstate. But when a blood-stained burlap sack tumbled from a speeding truck, 100 notorious bikers risked their freedom to form a wall of steel. What they found inside that bag will shatter your heart. Roaring engines shook the Mojave Desert floor, vibrating through the heavy leather boots of 100 men bound by patches, Brotherhood, and a reputation that preceded them wherever they rode. Mike Gallagher gripped the handlebars of his customized road glide, sweat beading on his forehead beneath his matte black helmet. As the president of this particular Hells Angels charter, Mike carried the immense weight of his brother's safety on his broad shoulders. He was a man chiseled from hard miles and harsh realities, a towering figure with a thick graying beard, arms covered in faded prison ink, and eyes that missed absolutely nothing on the highway. It was mid-July, and Interstate 15 was a blistering ribbon of asphalt cutting through a barren wasteland between Las Vegas and Los Angeles. The temperature gauge on Mike's dashboard read a suffocating 112 degrees. The heat waves radiating off the tarmac distorted the horizon, making the minivans and sedans ahead look as though they were physically melting into the pavement. Riding in a staggered, disciplined formation, the convoy commanded the road. Civilian drivers instinctively gave them a wide berth, intimidated by the sheer volume of noise and the undeniable presence of the leather-clad army. Beside Mike rode Derek van der Linde, known simply as Dutch to the club. Dutch was a mountain of a man, his face a rough canvas of old, brawling scars. But right now his eyes were narrowed behind dark sunglasses, fixed on a vehicle acting erratically a quarter-mile ahead. A rusted primer grey Chevy Silverado was weaving violently through the middle lane, kicking up dust and debris onto the windshields of the cars behind it. Mike's jaw tightened. He had spent decades reading the subtle language of the road, anticipating the chaotic, sometimes deadly mistakes of civilian drivers. The truck wasn't just drifting. It was swerving with an aggressive, reckless intent, cutting off a family in a Honda Accord before slamming on its brakes for no apparent reason. Suddenly, the passenger side window of the Silverado rolled down. A thick, sunburned arm extended into the rushing wind. Dangling from a meaty fist was a large, heavily stained burlap sack, tied frantically at the top with a piece of thick yellow nylon rope. Mike's stomach tightened. The sack wasn't just catching the wind, it was moving. Not flapping, but violently and desperately thrashing from the inside. He had seen a lot of cruelty in his 45 years on Earth. He had witnessed bar-room brawls, deep betrayals, and the darkest underbellies of society. But the sheer callous casualness of what happened next made his blood run completely cold. The driver of the truck didn't even tap his brakes. The arm holding the bag flicked outward with a sickening indifference. The heavy sack was hurled into the air, caught instantly by the 60-mile-per-hour slipstream, and slammed brutally onto the scorching asphalt of the fast lane. The Silverado's tires squealed loudly as the driver immediately floored the accelerator, cutting recklessly across 3 lanes of traffic, nearly clipping the front bumper of a massive semi-truck, and disappearing up a dusty exit ramp in a choking cloud of black exhaust. Behind them, absolute chaos erupted on the interstate. A woman in a white SUV screamed, slamming on her brakes and swerving wildly into the gravel shoulder to avoid the tumbling sack, sending up a massive cloud of dirt. The 18-wheeler blasted its deafening air horn, the massive vehicle violently shaking as the trucker desperately downshifted, trying to avoid jackknifing his rig and causing a multi-car pileup. Through the thick smoke of burning rubber and the terrifying cacophony of screeching brakes, the burlap sack rolled over and over, finally coming to a stop right on the white-dotted dividing line. It lay there, a bruised, helpless bundle, sitting squarely in the path of oncoming traffic that was still hurtling forward at highway speeds. And then Mike saw it. As the sack lay motionless on the superheated pavement, a dark crimson stain began to rapidly bloom through the coarse, dusty fabric. The frantic thrashing had stopped, replaced by a weak, rhythmic shudder that signaled whatever was inside was fading fast. There was absolutely no time for a club meeting. There was no time to weigh the severe legal consequences of intentionally shutting down a federal highway, an act that could land them all in handcuffs. Mike's hardened exterior, the ruthless persona that kept rival gangs at bay and law enforcement on their toes, completely dissolved in a fraction of a second. In that fleeting moment, he wasn't a notorious outlaw president. He was just a man staring at an innocent, desperate life about to be crushed beneath the unnoticing tires of oblivious commuters. Raising his left arm high into the rushing wind, Mike closed his heavy, leather-gloved hand into a tight, rigid fist. It was the universal club signal for an immediate dead stop. Executing this maneuver on a busy interstate was practically a death wish, requiring absolute precision and blind trust. The response from his club, however, was instantaneous and flawless. 100 seasoned riders operating on raw instinct executed a blockade that would have terrified even professional tactical drivers. Dutch swerved his massive custom chopper sideways, skidding his wide rear tire across the fast lane, leaving a thick black strip of rubber on the road. He came to a halt just inches from the front bumper of a terrified commuter's sedan, entirely cutting off the left lane. Behind him, dozens of bikers fanned out in a synchronized wave across all 4 lanes and the shoulders. The deafening roar of 100 heavy V-twin engines dropping their gears simultaneously sounded like a low-flying squadron of heavy bombers. They formed an impenetrable, menacing wall of chrome leather and steel stretching completely across the Mojave Interstate. Traffic came to a violent, screeching halt. The acrid smell of vaporized rubber and burnt brake pads choked the dry desert air, mingling with the suffocating heat. Inside the trapped cars, sheer panic set in. Drivers hit their automatic door locks, rolling up windows in sheer terror. From an outside perspective, it looked exactly like a coordinated highway hijacking by one of the most dangerous organizations in the country. Horns began to blare in furious protest, but the bikers didn't flinch an inch. They sat stoically on their idling, rumbling machines, glaring down any driver who dared to inch their vehicle forward. A man in a silver BMW, a few cars back aggressively, threw open his door, his face red with rage, shouting obscenities about calling the state troopers. Before his foot even hit the pavement, a heavily tattooed biker known as Irish, Tommy simply turned his head, locking eyes with the man, and raising a single scarred finger, pointing silently back at the car interior. The man swallowed hard, scrambled back into his leather seat, and slammed the door shut. No one else moved. Mike kicked his heavy iron kickstand down into the melting asphalt. The heat radiating upward from the ground was easily over 130 degrees. He dismounted his heavy boots, hitting the pavement with a deliberate thud. He didn't spare a single glance at the terrified faces pressed against the safety glass of the trapped cars. His piercing eyes were locked entirely on the motionless, bleeding burlap sack lying 20 yards away in the dead center of the highway. Every step he took felt like walking through deep water. The silence that fell over that specific patch of the interstate, contrasted against the idling motorcycle engines, felt heavy and suffocating. As he approached, the crimson stain on the fabric was growing, slowly pooling onto the white painted line, sizzling slightly against the boiling pavement. Mike dropped to his knees right in the middle of the highway, ignoring the burning heat searing through his denim jeans. Reaching down to his tactical belt, he unclipped a serrated hunting knife. His hands, which had never trembled in a knife fight or a high-speed chase, were shaking slightly as he carefully slid the blade under the thick, tightly knotted yellow nylon rope binding the top of the bag. With a swift upward pull, the rope snapped. The thick fabric fell open, and a collective audible gasp seemed to echo from the bikers who had quickly dismounted to form a protective circle around their president. Lying inside, gasping for air in the suffocating heat, was a pit bull retriever mix puppy. It couldn't have been more than 8 weeks old. The tiny animal was in a horrific, heart-wrenching state, severely emaciated, covered in splotches of crude, sticky motor oil, and bleeding from a deep, ugly gash on its hind leg, where the immense impact of the highway had split the skin. Its breathing was incredibly shallow, its rib cage shuddering with every agonizing gasp. But that wasn't what brought a massive, suffocating lump to the throat of this hardened biker. The puppy was whimpering softly, but despite the agony, it was clearly it wasn't trying to crawl away from the heat. It wasn't trying to escape the confines of the sack. Instead, it was using every ounce of its rapidly fading strength to curl its tiny, battered body protectively around an object nestled in the very bottom of the bag. Mike carefully reached in his massive, calloused hands, surprisingly gentle. He slowly pulled the shaking puppy back just enough to see what it was guarding so fiercely. It was a faded olive-drab military combat cap, stained with old sweat and dirt. Pinned securely to the fabric of the hat was a clear Ziploc bag. Inside the plastic was a piece of crinkled, tear-soaked notebook paper, accompanied by a small, heavy piece of metal that glinted in the harsh desert sun. A tarnished silver and purple medal. A purple heart. Mike gently picked up the plastic bag, his thumb brushing over the messy, childlike handwriting, visible through the plastic. The words were written in blue crayon, the letters jagged and uneven, pressed so hard into the paper that the wax tip had clearly snapped multiple times during the writing process. Mike opened the bag and pulled out the paper. Dutch kneeled down beside him, his massive frame blocking the sun from hitting the injured puppy. Dutch looked over Mike's shoulder as the president read the jagged blue letters. "My daddy didn't make it home from the desert," the note began. The paper warped by dried tears. "This is Buster. Buster was my daddy's best friend. Now my mummy's new boyfriend gets mad when Buster cries for him. He kicks him. Today he said he was going to take Buster away forever and throw him in the dirt. Please, if you find him, please tell him he is a good boy. I tried to hide him, but I am too small. I couldn't stop him. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Leo, age 9. Mike Gallagher, a man who hadn't shed a single tear since his own father was lowered into the ground 20 years ago, felt a hot, blinding sting in his eyes. He looked down at the tiny, broken creature. This dog had been thrown away like literal garbage out the window of a speeding truck by a deeply cruel man, yet it had spent its potentially final moments fiercely protecting the last remaining piece of a fallen soldier and a broken-hearted little boy. The puppy looked up at Mike. Its hazel eyes were clouded with unimaginable pain and exhaustion, but as Mike reached out his hand, the dog didn't flinch. Instead, it let out a soft, trusting whine, crawled half an inch forward, and rested its chin heavily on Mike's leather-clad forearm, leaving a smear of blood on the club patch stitched there. Dutch let out a ragged, shaky breath, slowly rising to his full height. He looked back at the line of 100 bikers, all of whom were now staring intently at their president, waiting for the call. Dutch's voice, usually a booming, intimidating growl, was eerily quiet and dangerously cold. "What's the play, boss?" Dutch asked, his eyes drifting toward the exit ramp, where the primer grey Silverado had disappeared. Mike carefully scooped the puppy up, wrapping his own heavy leather cut around the dog to shield its burnt paws from the hot air. He held the military cap and the note tightly against his chest. He stood up, looking at the faces of his brothers. They had stopped traffic to save a dog, but they had just stumbled into a war they fully intended to finish. "Call Doc," Mike commanded, referencing the club's underground medic back in Vegas. "Tell him to prep the table. We save the dog." Mike then looked down the long, shimmering stretch of highway, his expression hardening into something terrifying. "And Dutch, yeah, Mike, get a dozen guys, find that grey Silverado. We're going to have a little chat with Mummy's new boyfriend." Dust plumed into the blistering Mojave sky as the Hells Angels split their formation, executing a coordinated tactical maneuver born from years of riding as a single breathing entity. Mike Gallagher didn't look back to see if Dutch and his splinter group had successfully navigated the chaotic exit ramp. He knew they had. Instead, Mike buried the throttle of his road glide, pushing the heavy machine to a terrifying 120 miles per hour. Tucked safely inside his reinforced leather vest, secured against his chest to block the brutal wind, was the broken, oil-soaked puppy. The remaining 80-something bikers formed a protective high-speed wedge around their president, aggressively parting the traffic on Interstate 15 north toward Las Vegas. Every agonizing minute that ticked by felt like an hour. Mike could feel the tiny, rapid and irregular thumping of the dog's failing heart against his own ribs. Their destination wasn't a standard, brightly lit veterinary clinic. 100 Hells Angels storming a public animal hospital with a dying dog would draw a massive police presence, and the last thing Mike needed was state troopers asking questions about why they had blockaded a federal highway. Instead, they roared off the highway at Boulder Highway, weaving through the gritty industrial backstreets of Henderson, Nevada, until they reached a nondescript, corrugated metal warehouse. This was the domain of Richard Hayes, universally known to the club as Doc. Doc was a former combat medic who had served 3 brutal tours in Afghanistan before losing his official medical license, stateside, due to his own battles with addiction. The club had gotten him clean, set him up, and in return, Doc patched up bullet wounds, road rash, and broken bones with absolute discretion. As the deafening roar of 80 motorcycles filled the alleyway, the heavy steel warehouse door rolled up. Doc was already standing there, a pair of blue nitrile gloves snapped tightly over his hands, a makeshift surgical table sterilized, and ready under a bank of intensely bright halogen shop lights. Mike practically threw his heavy kickstand down, sprinting into the warehouse before the engine even sputtered out. "Gunshot blade?" Doc asked, rapidly assessing the blood on Mike's vest. "Neither." Mike growled, his voice thick with uncharacteristic emotion. He carefully unzipped his leather vest and gently placed the shivering, blood-soaked puppy onto the stainless steel table. He was thrown from a truck at 60 miles an hour. He's covered in motor oil, he's dehydrated, and he's got a massive laceration on his hindquarter. Doc's professional demeanor flickered for a fraction of a second as he looked at the tiny animal, but his combat training instantly took over. "Hold him down, Mike. Gently. He's going into deep shock." For the next 2 hours, the toughest, most feared men in Nevada stood in absolute silence inside a sweltering warehouse. Heavily tattooed men wiped sweat from their brows, their eyes glued to the small table. Doc worked flawlessly his hands, moving with the grace of a master surgeon. He administered a microscopic dose of painkiller, meticulously scrubbed the toxic motor oil from the pup's raw skin using a special detergent, and carefully stitched the deep, jagged tear on the dog's leg with 24 tiny sutures. He started an IV line into a vein so small it took Doc 3 tries with a magnifying glass to find it pumping vital saline and antibiotics into the severely dehydrated animal. Meanwhile, 40 miles away in the desolate desert town of Baker, California, a completely different kind of operation was unfolding. Dutch and his hand-picked crew of 12 seasoned enforcers were hunting. They hadn't blindly chased the primer grey Silverado into the desert abyss. They were methodical. Dutch knew a truck that aggressively beaten up overheating, and billowing black smoke wouldn't make it far in 112-degree heat without needing coolant gas or a place to cool the engine block. "Check the back lots," Dutch commanded through his helmet comms, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "He's hiding. He knows we saw him." They swept the dusty truck stops and abandoned diners off Zizek's Road, moving like a pack of wolves. It was Irish Tommy who found the prize, sitting in the cracked asphalt parking lot, behind a run-down, deeply faded motel on the outskirts of Baker, was the primer grey Chevy Silverado. The hood was ticking loudly, radiating massive heat, and the front grille was covered in fresh insect impacts. Dutch pulled his massive chopper silently alongside the driver's side door, while his crew completely surrounded the truck and the adjacent motel room, blocking every possible exit. Dutch didn't knock. He simply kicked the flimsy wooden door of Motel Room 7 right off its rusted hinges. The door slammed into the interior wall with a sound like a shotgun blast. Inside, a scrawny, sun-weathered man in a stained wife-beater tank top, who the club would later identify as Todd Miller, spilled his cheap beer across a dirty mattress, scrambling backward in sheer terror. He reached for a crowbar resting on the nightstand, but before his fingers even grazed the cold metal, Dutch's massive heavy leather boot pinned the man's forearm to the cheap carpet with bone-crushing force. Todd screamed, but the sound was instantly cut off as Irish Tommy grabbed him by the throat, hoisting him violently against the peeling wallpaper. Who are you?" Todd gasped, his eyes wide, as he stared into a sea of skull patches and cold, dead eyes. Dutch stepped forward, pulling a heavy folding knife from his pocket. He didn't open it. He simply tapped the heavy brass handle against Todd's sweating forehead right between the eyes. "You lost something on Interstate 15 today, Todd." Dutch whispered, his voice dangerously soft. It was infinitely scarier than a yell. A burlap sack, tied with yellow nylon. All the blood instantly drained from Todd's face. He realized in a horrifying instant that these heavily armed outlaws hadn't come for his money, his drugs, or his truck. They had come for the puppy he had tried to murder. I didn't mean to," Todd stammered, weeping openly now. The kid wouldn't shut up about the dog. It was annoying. I was just getting rid of a problem. Dutch's jaw clenched so hard, a muscle popped in his cheek. He leaned in his face, inches from Todd's. "You're going to tell me exactly where that little boy is. You're going to give me the address. And then you're going to pack your bags. Because if I ever see your face in Nevada or California again, I won't be using the handle of this knife." 3 days later, the stifling desert heat broke, giving way to a surprisingly cool Tuesday evening in Henderson, Nevada. At a modest fading stucco house on Horizon Ridge Parkway, 9-year-old Leo sat silently on the front porch step. His knees were pulled tightly to his chest. His mother, Jessica, a tired woman, working double shifts as a waitress to keep the lights on, watched him through the screen door, her heart breaking. Ever since Todd had vanished 3 days ago, leaving all his belongings and taking only his truck, after frantically calling to say he was fleeing the state, Leo had been inconsolable. Todd was gone, which was a blessing, but so was Buster. Leo clutched a picture of his father, an army sergeant, who had died in a roadside ambush in Syria 2 years prior. Buster had been a surprise gift from his dad just weeks before his final deployment. Now both were gone. Suddenly, a low rhythmic vibration began to shake the pebbles in the driveway. The sound was distant at first, like approaching thunder, but it rapidly grew into a massive, echoing roar. Jessica gasped, pushing open the screen door and stepping protectively in front of her son as the noise became deafening. Coming around the corner of their quiet suburban street wasn't a thunderstorm. It was an endless, gleaming river of chrome and black leather. 100 Hell's Angels rode in a flawless 2x2 formation, perfectly synchronized, filling the entire residential street. The neighbors peeked out from behind drawn blinds, entirely paralyzed by fear as the notorious motorcycle club rolled into their neighborhood. But they weren't there for trouble. At the front of the pack, Mike Gallagher raised his left fist. The entire convoy came to a smooth, rumbling halt right in front of Leo's house. The engines cut out in unison, leaving a heavy ringing silence in the evening air. Mike dismounted his road glide. He looked intimidating, a towering, heavily tattooed outlaw president. But as he walked up the cracked concrete driveway, his tough exterior melted away. Leo peeked around his mother's leg, his tear-streaked face pale with awe and confusion. Mike stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and slowly unzipped his heavy leather jacket. Tucked securely inside, wearing a tiny custom-made leather vest fitted over his fresh white bandages, was a brown and white pit bull retriever mix. "Buster!" Leo screamed, a sound of such pure, unadulterated joy that several hardened bikers in the street suddenly found themselves intensely staring at the sky, aggressively blinking away moisture. The puppy heard the voice and immediately began squirming, whining loudly. Mike knelt down on the concrete and gently set the puppy on the ground. Despite his injured leg, Buster scrambled up the porch stairs as fast as he could, launching himself into Leo's open arms. The boy buried his face in the dog's soft neck, sobbing uncontrollably. Jessica covered her mouth with trembling hands, weeping as she looked at Mike. How did you find him?" "Todd said he ran away." "Todd is a liar, Mom," Mike said, his voice deep and respectful. "And you don't have to worry about him ever coming back." He decided the Mojave climate wasn't to his liking. Mike reached into his pocket and pulled out the clear Ziploc bag containing the crinkled note, the military combat cap, and the tarnished purple heart. He handed them carefully to Leo, who looked up with wide, reverent eyes. "You wrote that your dad was a hero, Leo," Mike said, kneeling down so he was eye level with the young boy. "You wrote that Buster was a good boy. Well, you were right about both." Mike gently patted the dog's head, being mindful of the stitches. He protected this medal with his life. He took a hard hit for it, but he held on because he knew it belonged to you. Mike then stood up, looking at Jessica. "The vet bills are fully paid. The dog has a microchip registered to your name now. We also took the liberty of paying the next 6 months of your rent. A young man who respects his father's sacrifice like that shouldn't have to worry about the roof over his head." Jessica was entirely speechless, her knees weak as the sheer weight of their generosity washed over her. She tried to offer a thank you, but the words caught in her throat. Leo, still clutching Buster tightly, looked up at the towering biker. "Are you guys angels?" the boy asked, staring at the winged skull patched on the back of Mike's vest. Mike Gallagher chuckled a deep, rumbling sound. He looked back at his crew, Dutch-Irish Tommy, and 98 other heavily armed outlaws who had shut down an interstate, hunted down an abuser, and spent thousands of dollars to save a boy's best friend. "Something like that, kid." Mike smiled gently. "We're just the kind of angels that ride Harleys." Mike turned, walking back down the driveway. He mounted his bike, kicked it to life, and raised his fist one last time. As the thunder of 100 engines roared to life, shattering the quiet suburban evening, Leo stood on the porch, holding Buster tight, watching his protectors ride off into the Nevada sunset, a permanent wall of steel between him and the darkness of the world. Did this incredible story of brotherhood and rescue bring a tear to your eye? True heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they ride Harley-Davidsons. If Mike Dutch and their crew restored your faith in humanity, please hit that like button and share this video with your friends to spread the message against animal abuse. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell for more powerful real-life stories. What would you have done? Let us know below.